Hey guys, tonight we're going on a little trip. Not to a tropical beach, not to the moon, but somewhere much, much older and frankly a bit more fragrant. We're stepping right into medieval Europe. Close your eyes for a moment if you like. Imagine the soft hum of your fan, the gentle glow of your screen, the familiar comfort of your bed. Now, let's dial that comfort way, way down. Because tonight we're going to gently, very gently explore why you probably wouldn't last a single day in medieval Europe. You might think you're tough, you might think you're resourceful, but trust me, your modern self would be in for a very rude, very scratchy, very smelly awakening. Before we really dive in, just a quick note from your narrator here. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're up for it, I'd love to know where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. Just drop a comment below. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're standing there, right now, in the middle of a medieval village. The very first thing that hits you isn't a sight, it's a wave. An invisible, overwhelming wave of smell. It's not just one smell. Oh no. It's a symphony of smells, and none of them are particularly pleasant to your modern nose. You breathe in deeply, and your nose wrinkles automatically. There's the distinct sharp tang of animal waste, from the pigs rooting around the corner, the chickens clucking near your feet, the horses tethered not too far away. You can practically taste the earthy, damp scent of straw mixed with something unidentifiable, but definitely organic, underfoot. Then there's the smoke. Not the clean, crisp smell of a modern fireplace, but the thick, acrid smell of wood smoke from countless hearths, mingling with cooking fires and the workshops of blacksmiths. It hangs heavy in the air, a constant blanket that settles on everything. And then there's the human element, the subtle yet persistent scent of unwashed bodies, of stale clothes, of sweat, of breath that hasn't seen a modern toothbrush in, well, ever. You might even catch a whiff of decaying refuse because, well, waste management wasn't exactly a top priority back then. It's an assault on your senses, a constant reminder that you are utterly, completely out of your element. You can't just open a window for a fresh breeze, because the fresh breeze is probably just bringing more smells from somewhere else. It's enough to make your eyes water a little. This constant, multi-layered aroma that defines medieval life. Historians still ponder whether medieval people simply became accustomed to these smells, or if they just had a different standard of what smelled clean. It's a point of contention if they even noticed it as much as you do right now. Now let's talk about the sounds. You close your eyes again, trying to filter out the smells, and your ears are immediately filled with a cacophony that's both alien and strangely vital. The air vibrates with the clucking of chickens, the oinking of pigs, the occasional bleating of a goat. You hear the creak of wooden carts trundling slowly over uneven ground, the rhythmic thud of a blacksmith's hammer echoing from a nearby forge, the distant barking of a dog. There's the murmur of human voices, of course, but it's different. It's louder, perhaps, because there's no electricity to provide background hum, no traffic to drown out conversation. people shout across distances, their voices carrying easily. You hear the clatter of wooden shoes on cobblestones, the splash of slop being thrown from a window, the general hustle and bustle of life lived outdoors without the insulating bubble of modern technology. Suddenly a church bell begins to toll, a deep resonant sound that vibrates through the very ground beneath your feet. It's a sound that marks time, calls to prayer, warns of danger. It's the closest thing to a public clock you're likely to encounter. You realise there's no soft hum of refrigerators, no distant rumble of cars, no faint buzz of electronic devices. The quiet moments are truly quiet, filled only with the natural sounds of the world and the sounds of human endeavour. It's almost startling in its intensity, this raw, unfiltered soundscape. You find yourself leaning into it, trying to pick out individual sounds, but they all blend into a living, breathing tapestry of noise. One quirky tidbit about medieval soundscapes is that some scholars believe people had a much more developed sense of hearing due to the lack of constant, low-level background noise we experience today. You can almost feel the vibrations of sounds through your body, a sensation that's completely new. It's a strange mix of the familiar and the utterly foreign. You instinctively reach for your phone, perhaps to check the time or just to scroll through something comforting, something known. But of course, there's no phone, no electricity, no digital world. You look down at your hands and they're still your hands, but everything else is different. You feel the rough, coarse fabric of the tunic you're now wearing. It's wool, probably, or linen, and it's not soft. It's a little scratchy against your skin. You notice the simple leather shoes on your feet. They're practical, but not exactly cushioned. You can feel every pebble, every uneven bit of ground beneath you. Your body feels exposed, perhaps, to the elements in a way you're not used to. The air is cooler than you might expect, even indoors, and you realise insulation wasn't exactly a priority in medieval architecture. This isn't a museum visit. This is real. This is your life now. And it's only been, 5 minutes? You haven't even had time to fully process the visual information yet, but the smells and sounds have already told you so much. You might even catch yourself trying to breathe through your mouth to avoid the strongest odours, a habit you'll quickly discover isn't very practical for living. The sheer density of living things, animals, people, insects, is overwhelming. A modern historical fact that really drives this home is that the average population density in a medieval town was significantly higher than in modern cities, despite the lack of tall buildings, meaning people and animals were packed in very tightly. This, of course, contributed to Oslo's amazing smells and sounds. It's a fundamental shift in how you interact with the world around you. You're no longer a detached observer. You're part of this vibrant, gritty, noisy, and yes, very smelly environment. You're starting to understand that survival here isn't about having the latest tech or the smartest strategies. It's about adapting to the raw, visceral realities of daily life right from your very first breath. And you've barely begun. So you've taken your first deep breath of medieval air, a breath you might want to forget but can't. Now, let's talk about another fundamental human need, one that's going to be a constant, unpleasant surprise for you, managing your daily business. Yes, we're talking about medieval toilets, or rather, the distinct lack thereof. If you're used to the privacy, porcelain, and pristine flushing power of your modern bathroom, prepare for a gentle shock. Because in medieval Europe, things were different, very different. Imagine, if you will, the sudden urgent need. You look around, perhaps a little frantically, for a familiar sign. A door with a small figure, maybe. A helpful arrow pointing the way. You won't find one. Instead, your options are limited, and none of them involve a pleasant sanitary experience. If you happen to be in a grand castle, you might be in luck. Castles, in their impressive way, had a rudimentary form of plumbing called a garderobe. This was essentially a small closet-like room built into the thickness of the castle wall. It had a hole in the floor, and that hole led directly, and I mean directly, down the side of the castle wall, depositing its contents into a moat, or more commonly a cesspit at the base. It was pretty effective for waste removal, and some scholars even debate if the ammonia from the waste had a delousing effect on clothes hung in the garderobe, hence the name garderobe, which sounds a bit like wardrobe. A very fragrant wardrobe indeed. But even in a castle, privacy wasn't quite what you're used to. Sometimes multiple garderobes would empty into the same pit, meaning you might have company, or at least be very aware of it. And the smell, even in a castle, would be pungent, to say the least, especially on a warm day. You'd probably wrinkle your nose and try to hold your breath, a futile exercise you'd quickly abandon. But what if you're not in a castle? What if you're, as is more likely, in a bustling medieval town or a quiet village? Here, your options become even more rustic. Public latrines did exist in some larger towns, communal affairs where a wooden bench with multiple holes sat over a flowing ditch or a large pit. Picture sharing a bench with a dozen other people, with no partitions, no privacy, and no pleasant air freshener. You'd just have to get comfortable with the concept of communal bodily functions. It's certainly a conversation starter, if nothing else. You might try to avert your gaze, hum a little tune, anything to create a tiny bubble of personal space. But you'd quickly learn that personal space was a luxury, especially when it came to, well, relieving yourself. And then there was the most common method, especially for the common folk, the street. Yes, you heard that right. It was disturbingly common for people to simply relieve themselves in alleys, ditches, or even directly onto the street. Imagine trying to navigate narrow, muddy paths, constantly vigilant for what might have been left behind. It adds a whole new layer of texture to your morning commute. This practice, of course, contributed significantly to the smells we talked about earlier, and also to the spread of disease. It's a historical fact that medieval towns were incredibly unsanitary by modern standards, largely due to the lack of proper waste disposal. People simply didn't understand the link between waste and illness in the way we do now. So you've done your business somehow. Now, the next challenge, what to wipe with. Forget the soft, multiply rolls you're accustomed to. Toilet paper, as we know it, was centuries away from being invented. Your options were far less appealing. You might use leaves, if you were lucky enough to be in a leafy area. You might use straw or hay, which would be rather rough. Perhaps a handful of moss, or if you were very poor, you might use nothing at all, simply relying on your clothes or the general grime to do the job. If you were slightly more well off, you might use a piece of cloth which one can only assume would be washed and reused. This brings us to a slightly humorous, though grim thought. Imagine accidentally grabbing the wrong piece of cloth in the morning, a mistake you probably wouldn't make twice. This lack of proper hygiene, combined with the general living conditions, meant that things like fleas and lice were just a common part of life. You'd constantly be scratching an itch you couldn't quite get rid of. The concept of hygiene was simply different. People might wash their hands occasionally, but full-body bathing was a rare luxury, often associated with specific health treatments or rituals, rather than daily cleanliness. And even when they did bathe, the water itself might not be particularly clean. It's a point of contention among historians whether medieval people were truly ignorant of sanitation's importance, or if the sheer scale of the population combined with limited technology simply made effective waste management an impossible dream. You'd quickly learn to hold your breath, to avert your eyes, and to simply accept that your concept of clean was no longer applicable. The smell of human waste was just another scent in the air, a constant reminder of the realities of life. And as you try to drift off to sleep tonight, perhaps you can be thankful for the simple, quiet luxury of a flush toilet. It's a little thing, but it's a modern convenience you'd miss very, very quickly. You'd probably spend a lot of your medieval day just trying to find a somewhat discreet and less offensive place to go. And you'd definitely be a lot more mindful of where you step. Every puddle, every ditch, every shady corner would be a potential minefield of unpleasant surprises. Welcome to medieval sanitation. All right. You've survived your first whiffs of medieval life and navigated the thrilling world of medieval facilities. Now let's talk about something truly vital. Food. What's for dinner? And perhaps more importantly, is there anything for dinner? In medieval Europe, your daily meal was dictated by a few major factors: your social standing, the season, and pure, unadulterated luck. Forget your perfectly portioned, hygienically prepared, globally sourced modern meal. Your medieval plate would look and taste very, very different. If you're a commoner, a peasant working the land, your diet would be simple, monotonous, and focused on sustenance rather than gourmet delight. Your main staple would be bread, not the fluffy white sliced bread you're used to. Oh no, this would be dark, coarse bread, often made from rye or barley, sometimes mixed with peas or beans to stretch it further. It would be dense, heavy, and probably a little stale, but it would be your primary source of calories. Imagine chewing through a brick of this stuff every day. It's practical, but not exactly a culinary adventure. You'd probably find yourself thinking about a soft baguette from time to time, or maybe just a simple, well-made sourdough. A historical fact about medieval bread is that it was often incredibly tough due to the milling process and the types of grains used, sometimes so much so that it was used as trenchers, a sort of edible plate upon which other food was placed. Alongside your bread, you'd have pottage. This was a thick, savoury stew, a consistent feature of almost every meal. It would contain whatever vegetables were in season: cabbage, onions, peas, beans, leeks, cooked slowly with grains, perhaps some herbs, and if you were incredibly fortunate, a tiny bit of meat or fat for flavour. Pottage was practical because it could be cooked all day over the fire, and new ingredients could be added as they became available. It was warm, filling, and helped to use up whatever was on hand. You'd eat it with a spoon or just your hands, perhaps tearing off bits of your dense bread to scoop it up, and you'd eat the same thing, day in and day out. Variation would be a rare and exciting event. You might start craving a simple salad just for a change, but fresh greens weren't really a common part of the diet. Meat was a luxury for most common folk. If you were lucky, you might have a little pork from a family pig, or perhaps some chicken eggs. But beef and lamb were typically reserved for special occasions or for the wealthier classes. Fish was more common, especially on designated fasting days, which were numerous, thank you very much, medieval church. On these days you'd have to forego meat, and often dairy too, relying on fish, vegetables and grains. You'd quickly realise that your modern concept of meat every day was simply impossible for the vast majority of people. And when you did get meat, it often wouldn't be the prime cuts you're used to. It might be cured, salted or smoked, as refrigeration didn't exist. Imagine trying to keep meat fresh in a world without ice boxes. That's why preserving food was such a crucial skill. Speaking of preservation, medieval people were masters of it. They dried, salted, smoked, and fermented their food to make it last through the long winters. Fruits might be dried, vegetables might be pickled. But fresh produce, especially outside of harvest season, was scarce. You wouldn't just pop to the supermarket for a ripe avocado in January. Your diet would shrink to the non-perishable staples, and scurvy, a disease caused by lack of vitamin C, was a very real risk, especially towards the end of winter. It's a slightly funny thought, in a dark way, that your body would slowly start to fall apart because you couldn't get your daily dose of citrus. You'd probably find yourself longing for a simple orange, a bright burst of flavour you'd never appreciated before. For drinks, water was often unsafe, so what did everyone drink? Ale or beer? This wasn't the strong alcoholic brew you might think of today. Medieval ale was relatively weak, often made in the home and brewed from grains. The brewing process, which involved boiling the water, made it safer to drink than plain water from a well or river, which could be contaminated. So instead of a refreshing glass of tap water, you'd be sipping on a mild, often cloudy ale from morning till night. It's a quirky, lesser-known tidbit that even children drank ale, albeit a weaker version, as it was often the safest hydration option available. You might feel a constant lightheadedness for a while, a mild buzz that accompanies your daily life. Now, if you were a noble, your diet would be significantly richer, but still perhaps not what you'd expect. You'd have more meat, often roasted or stewed, seasoned heavily with expensive imported spices like pepper, ginger, cloves, and cinnamon. These spices weren't just for flavour, they also helped to mask the taste of meat that might be a little less than fresh. You'd eat finer white bread and have access to more varieties of poultry, game, and even exotic meats like swans or peacocks served as impressive centerpieces. Wine would replace ale as your primary drink. However, even for the wealthy, fresh fruits and vegetables were seasonal, and the overall diet could still be lacking in certain nutrients. Historians still debate the nutritional value of medieval diets across different social classes, with some arguing that even the peasant diet, while monotonous, was surprisingly calorie-rich and sustainable given the hard physical labour. but it certainly wasn't varied. You'd quickly learn to eat everything that was put in front of you. Food waste would be an unthinkable luxury. Every scrap, every crumb would be precious. You'd understand hunger in a way you never have before, not as a fleeting discomfort, but as a constant gnawing presence. The satisfaction of a simple hot meal would be profound, a deep comfort you'd never felt when ordering takeout. Your taste buds would adapt, perhaps learning to appreciate the subtle flavours of root vegetables and coarse grains. But you'd also constantly remember the crisp crunch of a modern salad, the sweet burst of a fresh fruit, or the satisfying chew of a perfectly cooked steak. And you definitely miss the ability to just grab a snack whenever you felt peckish. You might even find yourself dreaming of a simple sandwich, a concept that wouldn't exist for centuries. Your relationship with food would change entirely, from one of abundance and choice to one of scarcity and survival. Having sampled the fine dining, or lack thereof, of medieval Europe, let's consider your wardrobe. You might have arrived in your comfy jeans and soft t-shirt, but those are gone now. You're now dressed in the typical medieval garb, and let me tell you, it's a far cry from your favourite breathable fabrics and ergonomic designs. Welcome to the world of medieval fashion, where functionality often trumped comfort and itchy was the new soft. Let's start with the basics, the materials. Most medieval clothing, especially for the common person, was made from wool or linen. Wool was fantastic for warmth, but it was often coarse, not the fine merino wool you might find today. Imagine wearing a scratchy wool blanket directly against your skin, all day, every day. It's going to itch, a lot. Linen was more comfortable, made from flax, and often used for undergarments because it was smoother and more breathable. But even linen wasn't washed with modern detergents or softened with fabric conditioner. It would still feel stiff and, well, natural. Cotton was a rare and expensive import, generally only for the very wealthy, and silk was even more so. You'd find yourself constantly adjusting, perhaps scratching an annoying itch on your arm or leg, a discomfort you'd simply have to get used to. Your typical outfit as a commoner would be quite simple. Men would wear a tunic, essentially a long shirt, often knee-length, perhaps belted at the waist. Underneath, they might have linen breeches or drawers. Women would wear a long dress or kirtle, often layered, with an under-tunic. Both sexes would wear hose or stockings, probably held up with garters. Layers were key, especially in winter, as houses weren't well heated. You'd learn to appreciate the concept of thermal layering in a whole new way, but without the benefit of lightweight, high-tech materials. Your clothes would feel heavy, perhaps a bit cumbersome. And then there's the issue of cleanliness. Modern washing machines and hot water were centuries away. Clothes were washed, yes, but infrequently, and often with lye or harsh soaps that weren't exactly gentle on the fabric or the skin. Imagine wearing the same outer garments for weeks, even months without a thorough wash. The smells we talked about earlier, a good portion of them would be clinging to your clothes. And don't forget the constant battle with pests. Fleas and lice were simply a fact of life for everyone, regardless of social standing. Your clothes would be their prime real estate. You might find yourself subtly scratching, or perhaps not so subtly, trying to dislodge an unwelcome visitor. It's a slightly unsettling thought that your clothing wasn't just a barrier against the elements, but a potential host for tiny itchy creatures. Now, for your feet. Shoes were typically simple leather affairs. They weren't designed for arch support, cushioning, or breathability. They were sturdy, often made for specific trades, and often made of tough, unprocessed leather. You'd probably feel every stone, every bit of uneven ground. You'd also find your feet sweating more, and without the benefit of modern socks, blisters, and foot odour, would be constant companions. A quirky tidbit about medieval shoes is that a style known as craquois or poulaines, long pointed shoes, were incredibly fashionable for a time, but could be so long they had to be tied to the wearer's knee to avoid tripping. Not very practical for a quick getaway from a grumpy lord. If you were a noble, your clothes would be more elaborate, made from finer wools, linens, and sometimes silk or even velvet, dyed in vibrant, expensive colours. You'd have more layers, more intricate designs, and perhaps even some decorative embroidery. Women might wear corsets or stays to create fashionable silhouettes, which, while beautiful, were certainly not about comfort. Men might wear elaborate tunics, cloaks, and perhaps even early forms of breeches or doublets. But even with finer materials, the fundamental issues of washing, lack of breathability, and insect infestations remained. A historical fact about medieval fashion is the existence of sumptuary laws, which were laws dictating what people of certain social classes were allowed to wear. This was to prevent commoners from dressing above their station, and to maintain clear visual distinctions between the classes. So you couldn't just decide to wear a fancy silk gown if you were a peasant. Even if you somehow got your hands on one, you'd quickly learn that medieval clothing, while perhaps visually interesting from a modern perspective, was designed for durability and function in a challenging environment. It wasn't about being comfortable or fresh or stylish in the way we understand it today. It was about protection from the elements, identification of social status, and simply getting through the day. You'd learn to appreciate the softness of a cotton t-shirt, the stretch of athletic wear, and the sheer luxury of wearing clean, fresh clothes every single day. The feeling of being perpetually slightly damp, slightly dirty, and constantly aware of the texture of your clothes against your skin would be a new, constant sensation. Historians still debate the true impact of these clothing conditions on the daily health and well-being of medieval people, but one thing is clear: your modern skin would definitely protest. You'd probably find yourself itching in places you didn't know could itch, and wishing for a laundry detergent advertisement to magically appear. You've made it through the smells, the toilet surprises, the bland food, and the itchy clothes. Now, let's talk about moving around. In your modern life, you probably hop in a car, jump on a train, or even zip around on an electric scooter without a second thought. Getting around in medieval Europe, however, was an entirely different beast. Forget rapid transit. Welcome to the world of the very slow, the very uncomfortable, and often the very dangerous. Your primary mode of transport in medieval Europe would be your own 2 feet. Yes, walking. Almost everyone walked, almost everywhere. Whether you were going to the next village, to the market, or just across town, your legs were your best, and often only, option. Imagine walking miles every day through fields, over hills, along narrow paths, and through bustling, often muddy village streets. Your modern, perhaps sedentary feet would be in for a rude awakening. You'd quickly develop calluses, blisters, and an entirely new appreciation for comfortable footwear. Those simple leather shoes we talked about in the last section, they'd feel even less comfortable after a few hours of trudging through mud. You'd learn to navigate uneven terrain, to step around puddles of questionable origin, and to simply endure the physical strain of constant walking. And the roads? Oh, the roads. Forget smooth asphalt or even well-maintained gravel. Medieval roads were often little more than tracks worn into the landscape by centuries of use. They would be dusty in summer, incredibly muddy and deeply rutted in winter, and often riddled with potholes big enough to swallow a small animal. If it rained, they'd become quagmires, sucking at your shoes with every step. There were no road signs, no street lights, and certainly no GPS. You'd rely on local knowledge, landmarks, and perhaps the occasional fellow traveller to find your way. It's a historical fact that the quality of roads declined significantly after the Roman Empire, meaning medieval travel was often much rougher than in earlier eras. This lack of infrastructure made even short journeys feel like epic expeditions. If you were lucky enough to be a merchant or a noble, you might travel by horse or by cart. But even this wasn't the luxurious ride you might imagine. Horses were slower than modern vehicles, and their pace was often dictated by the terrain. A sturdy two-wheeled cart pulled by oxen or horses would be slow, bumpy, and exposed to the elements. You'd be jolted and shaken over every rut and stone. Imagine trying to read or relax while being constantly bounced around. And even on horseback, journeys were tiring, requiring frequent stops for rest, food, and water for both rider and animal. You'd probably find yourself dreaming of a simple paved road just for a moment of smooth sailing. The dangers of travel were also very real. Bandits and outlaws often lurked in forests and along lonely stretches of road, preying on vulnerable travellers. Wild animals were also a concern, especially at night. You'd also face the unpredictable nature of the weather, with no modern forecast to warn you of approaching storms or sudden temperature drops. Getting stuck in a blizzard or a torrential downpour far from shelter would be a truly terrifying prospect. You'd probably travel in groups whenever possible, relying on the safety in numbers, or hire armed guards if you had the means. A quirky tidbit is that some medieval travel guides existed, but they were often more focused on pilgrimage routes and significant landmarks rather than giving practical advice on avoiding muddy bogs or brigands. Long journey took an incredibly long time. To travel from one major city to another, even within the same country, could take weeks or even months. News travelled slowly, often by word of mouth, carried by merchants or pilgrims. The concept of a quick weekend getaway was simply unimaginable. Your world would be much smaller, confined to the immediate vicinity of your village or town, with only occasional trips to larger markets or religious sites. This limited mobility meant that most people lived their entire lives within a very small geographical area, rarely venturing more than a few miles from their birthplace. Historians still debate the true extent of medieval travel. While most people stayed put, trade routes and pilgrimages did mean that some individuals covered vast distances, albeit slowly and with great difficulty. But for you, the average person, your world would shrink dramatically in size. You'd quickly adapt to the slower pace of life, perhaps, but the physical toll would be immense. Your leg muscles would ache, your feet would throb, and your back would protest the constant jolt of walking or riding on rough paths. You'd learn to appreciate the rare moments of rest, perhaps by a roadside inn, which wouldn't be much like a modern hotel, but that's a story for another time. You'd understand, truly understand, why people built their lives around proximity to essential resources. The idea of commuting any significant distance would be absurd. Your universe would be defined by how far you could walk in a day, and you'd find yourself constantly calculating distances in terms of footsteps and exhaustion, not miles per hour. You might even find yourself longing for the simple comfort of a bus stop. Just the thought of being able to sit down and be transported without effort. You felt the coarse clothes, experienced the dubious plumbing, and tasted the humble pottage. Now, imagine a different kind of challenge, one that could truly make your medieval day very, very short. Sickness. In your modern life, a cough might mean a quick trip to the pharmacy, a fever might lead to a doctor's visit and antibiotics. In medieval Europe, however, falling ill was a terrifying roll of the dice, and the ways people tried to get well would seem, to your modern mind, absolutely bizarre. First and foremost, the medieval world had no concept of germs. The idea that tiny, invisible creatures could make you sick was completely unknown. Instead, illness was often attributed to imbalances in the body's humours: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. If these four fluids weren't in perfect balance, you got sick. So what was the solution? Often, to restore the balance, they'd try to remove some of the bad humour. This is where bloodletting comes in. Imagine a doctor, or more likely a barber surgeon. Yes, the person who cuts hair also performs minor surgery and extractions, coming to your bedside with a sharp knife or leeches. They'd cut a vein or apply leeches to literally drain some of your blood, believing it would remove the excess humour making you ill. You'd probably faint at the sight, or at least feel very squeamish. It might sound funny now, but this was a deeply held belief, and it was a very common practice, even for conditions like a headache or a cold. It's a mainstream historical fact that bloodletting was a cornerstone of medieval medicine, often used to treat almost every ailment imaginable. Beyond humours, illness was also sometimes blamed on bad air, known as miasma, or even divine punishment. So, if you were feeling unwell, you might find yourself praying intensely, perhaps going on a pilgrimage, or even wearing amulets and charms to ward off evil spirits. You might be given foul-tasting concoctions made from herbs, animal parts, or even ground-up precious stones. Imagine trying to swallow a spoonful of a mixture that includes powdered mummy or the liver of a toad, all because someone believed it would cure your fever. You'd probably gag. A quirky, lesser-known tidbit is that unicorn horn, though almost certainly rhino horn, was believed to be a powerful antidote to poison and a cure-all, fetching exorbitant prices. The sheer absurdity of some of these remedies by modern standards is almost chuckle-worthy, but for the medieval person, it was serious business, often a matter of life or death. Common diseases were rampant and terrifyingly effective. The Black Death, of course, is the most famous example, wiping out huge portions of the population. But even everyday illnesses like dysentery, a nasty stomach bug, Smallpox, influenza, and various fevers were often deadly. With no antibiotics, a simple infection from a cut could turn fatal very quickly. You'd probably be constantly worried about getting sick, and every cough or sniffle would send a shiver down your spine. Imagine waking up with a sore throat, knowing that without modern medicine, it could spiral into something truly life-threatening. The lack of understanding about hygiene, sanitation, and germ transmission. Remember those medieval toilets and unwashed clothes meant that diseases spread easily and rapidly. If you broke a bone, a barber surgeon might try to set it, but their knowledge of anatomy was rudimentary at best. Amputations were performed, but without anaesthesia, beyond perhaps a strong drink or a knock to the head, and with a very high risk of infection. Dental care was virtually non-existent. If you had a toothache, the solution was often extraction, performed with crude tools and immense pain. You'd quickly realise how much you rely on your dentist for even minor issues. The sheer pain tolerance you'd need to get through even basic medieval medical procedures would be off the charts. Childbirth was incredibly dangerous for both mother and baby. Without modern obstetrics, many women died during labour, and infant mortality rates were incredibly high. Losing several children was a tragically common experience for medieval parents. This constant presence of death, especially from illness, would shape your entire outlook on life. You'd probably feel a deep sense of vulnerability, a profound understanding of how fragile life truly was. Historians still ponder whether some medieval herbal remedies had genuine medicinal properties, or if their perceived effectiveness was purely due to placebo effects or the body's natural healing. It's a point of contention if medieval doctors were truly trying to cure or just manage symptoms, as their understanding was so limited. But one thing is clear. Your modern expectation of a quick recovery, a sterile environment, and effective medication would be dashed almost immediately. You'd probably spend a good portion of your medieval day just trying to stay healthy, avoiding crowds, washing your hands, though not really understanding why it helped, and hoping for the best. And when illness did strike, you'd face it with a deep sense of fatalism, knowing that your chances of recovery were often slim, and the cure might be worse than the disease. You might even find yourself wishing for a simple band-aid and some antiseptic wipes. Simple things you'd never thought twice about before, so you've somehow managed to avoid falling gravely ill, a feat in itself in medieval Europe. Now let's talk about your daily schedule. Forget your 9 to 5, your lunch breaks, or your relaxing evenings. Your new job for almost everyone in medieval society was simply work, and it was hard. Physical labour from sun-up to sundown every single day. Most people in medieval Europe were peasants, meaning they lived in the countryside and worked the land. Your life would be dictated by the seasons and the demands of agriculture. From the moment the sun began to peek over the horizon, you'd be out in the fields. Imagine the cold, crisp morning air hitting your face as you leave your smoky, cramped dwelling. You wouldn't have a specific job title like software engineer or marketing specialist. Your title would be peasant, and your work would be to ensure you and your family, and importantly your lord, had enough food to survive. During spring you'd be ploughing the fields, often with oxen pulling a heavy wooden plough. This isn't a tractor-driven, air-conditioned experience. This is walking behind an animal, guiding a heavy, stubborn piece of equipment through thick, sometimes rocky earth, your muscles straining with every step. Then comes the sowing, scattering seeds by hand across vast fields, a task requiring patience and a good eye. You'd be hunched over, back aching, hands calloused. You'd probably find yourself thinking about the relative ease of simply pushing a button on a coffee machine, a luxury so far removed from your current reality. Summer brings weeding, tending to the crops and scaring off birds or other pests. It's hot, dusty work under the unrelenting sun. You'd be constantly thirsty, perhaps sipping on that mild ale we talked about, and then comes the harvest. This was arguably the most crucial and demanding time of the year. Imagine wielding a scythe, a long curved blade, swinging it rhythmically for hours on end to cut down grain, or stooping low to gather sheaves of wheat or barley. The work was continuous, back-breaking, and often done in large communal groups, fueled by a shared understanding that if the harvest failed, everyone suffered. A mainstream historical fact is that around 80–90% of the medieval population lived in rural areas and worked in agriculture, making it the bedrock of society. This means your chances of having a desk job were practically zero, and it wasn't just field work. If you were a man, you might also be involved in building repairs, felling trees for timber or maintaining tools. If you were a woman, your labour was equally relentless. You'd be responsible for the household, preparing food, spinning wool into thread, weaving cloth, making and repairing clothes, caring for children, tending a small garden, and often assisting in the fields during busy seasons. The work of a medieval woman was a constant juggle of domestic duties and agricultural support, truly from morning until night. There was no work-life balance as you understand it. Life was work. Children, too, started working from a very young age, often as soon as they could walk. They'd help with chores, gather firewood, tend to animals, or assist their parents in the fields. There was no concept of childhood as a protected period for learning and play in the modern sense. Every hand was needed to ensure the family's survival. You'd probably look at your modern children and feel a wave of intense gratitude for their easy lives. There were no weekends, no national holidays, and certainly no paid vacation days. Your work ended when the sun went down, and you were too exhausted to do anything but eat your pottage and fall onto your straw bed. Sundays might offer a reprieve for church attendance, but even then essential chores still had to be done. The only breaks might come during major feast days, religious festivals, but even these often involve communal tasks or celebrations that could still be physically demanding. It's a point of contention among historians if medieval peasants truly had leisure time as we define it, or if all non-work activities were simply extensions of community survival. Some scholars argue that while formal holidays were few, the pace of work was often intermittent, allowing for some breaks, but you certainly wouldn't be relaxing in front of a screen. A quirky, lesser-known tidbit is that while most work was incredibly manual, medieval people were ingenious with simple machines like watermills and windmills, harnessing natural power for grinding grain and other tasks. These were technological marvels of their time, but they only alleviated a small portion of the overall physical burden. Your hands would be rough, calloused, and probably stained with dirt. Your muscles would ache in places you didn't even know existed. You'd be perpetually tired, as deep, bone-weary exhaustion that sleep could barely touch. The idea of hitting the gym for exercise would be laughably unnecessary. Your entire life was a workout. You'd probably find yourself dreaming of a comfortable chair and a soft blanket, just a moment of true physical repose. You felt the aches of medieval labour. Now let's imagine coming home after a long day in the fields. Your concept of home sweet home is about to be gently but firmly adjusted. Forget central heating, insulated walls, spacious rooms, or private bedrooms. Your medieval dwelling would be, by your standards, incredibly basic, often cramped, and frequently shared with more than just your family. If you were a common peasant, your house would likely be a simple one-room structure, perhaps made of wattle and daub, a framework of woven branches, wattle, plastered with a mix of clay, straw, and dung, daub. The roof would be thatched with straw or reeds. It would be small, perhaps only big enough for your family to sleep, eat, and spend the few non-working hours. There would be very few windows, or perhaps just a single opening, often without glass, making the interior perpetually dim and draughty. Imagine trying to read by the meagre light of a single candle after sunset, or trying to thread a needle in the perpetual gloom. You definitely miss modern electricity and bright lights. At the heart of the home would be a central hearth, a fire pit, often directly on the dirt floor. This fire was for cooking and for warmth, but here's the catch. Medieval peasant homes often didn't have chimneys in the way we understand them. Smoke would simply drift up into the rafters and eventually find its way out through a smoke hole in the roof, or through the cracks in the walls. This meant the interior of your home would be constantly smoky, filling with a haze that would sting your eyes and leave a pervasive smell on everything, including your clothes and hair. You'd probably find yourself coughing a lot, and your eyes would be perpetually red and watery. It's a mainstream historical fact that medieval homes were incredibly smoky, contributing to respiratory issues for their inhabitants. And speaking of living conditions, you wouldn't just be sharing your home with your human family. It was incredibly common, especially in smaller peasant dwellings, for livestock to share the space. Pigs, chickens, or even a cow might have their own designated corner of your single-room house, especially during harsh winters, to keep them safe and to utilize their body heat. Imagine waking up to the clucking of chickens right beside your straw-filled bed, or the distinct aroma of farm animals permeating your living space. You'd probably find this very peculiar, and certainly not what you'd call cozy. It's a quirky, lesser-known tidbit that this practice of housing animals indoors was not just for warmth, but also for security, protecting valuable livestock from theft or predators. Furniture would be minimal and functional. A simple wooden table, a few stools or benches, and perhaps a wooden chest for storing belongings. Your bed would likely be a straw-filled mattress or sack, perhaps laid directly on the floor or on a simple wooden frame. Privacy, as you know it, was non-existent. Everyone slept in the same room, often sharing body warmth. There were no separate bedrooms, no quiet corners for solitary reflection. You'd learn to live in very close quarters with your family, with very little personal space. You definitely miss the privacy of your own bedroom, or even just a closed door. There was no running water, so fetching water from a well or nearby stream would be a daily chore. No indoor plumbing, as we discussed, no electricity for lights, cooking or entertainment, and no insulation beyond the basic materials. Your home would be cold in winter, hot in summer, and damp and drafty pretty much all the time. You'd learn to bundle up indoors, to sleep close to the fire for warmth, and to adapt to the constant fluctuations of temperature inside your dwelling. Even if you were a wealthier town dweller, your home might be larger and have more rooms, perhaps even multiple stories, but still wouldn't feature modern comforts. It might be made of timber and plaster, with a tiled roof, but still no running water, no proper sanitation, and limited heating beyond fireplaces in a few main rooms. The air would still be smoky, and even in townhouses the smells of the street would often waft inside. It's a point of contention among historians if these conditions truly constituted comfort for medieval people, or if they just had a different standard of what a home should provide. But for you, coming from a modern house or apartment, it would be a constant adjustment to the lack of basic amenities. You'd probably spend a lot of time outside, not just for work, but also for fresh air. You might even find yourself wishing for a simple blanket and a quiet corner, just to escape the constant sensory input and the lingering chill. You've had a taste of medieval domesticity, such as it is. Now let's consider another vital aspect of your medieval day: the law. Forget your modern understanding of fair trial, due process, or independent judiciary. In medieval Europe, the law was often immediate, personal, and shockingly harsh. A small mistake could lead to very big, very painful trouble, and your concept of justice would be turned entirely on its head. In most places, especially in rural areas, the local lord was the law. He owned the land, he commanded the people, and he dispensed justice in his own court. His word was often final. There wasn't a separate police force or a system of appeals as you know it. If you had a dispute with a neighbour, or if you were accused of a crime, you would go before the Lord or his representative. The idea of innocent until proven guilty was not widely applied. Instead, accusations often carried heavy weight, and demonstrating your innocence could be incredibly difficult. A mainstream historical fact is that feudal lords held immense power over the lives of their tenants, including judicial authority, shaping every aspect of daily life. Punishments were often physical and public. The goal was not just to punish the individual, but to deter others through fear and humiliation. Imagine being caught stealing a loaf of bread. A desperate act born of hunger, perhaps. Your punishment might not be a jail sentence. Instead, you might be put in the stocks or the pillory in the centre of the village. Your head and hands, or feet, would be locked in wooden frames, leaving you exposed to public ridicule. Passers-by might mock you, throw rotten vegetables, or even worse. You'd be cold, uncomfortable, and utterly humiliated. This public shaming was a very real part of medieval justice. You'd probably cringe at the thought and vow to never, ever cross the Lord. For more serious crimes, the punishments were even more severe. Theft could lead to mutilation, such as having a hand cut off. Treason or serious rebellion against the lord or king could result in execution, often by hanging. Torture was used to extract confessions, and the legal system lacked the protections against self-incrimination that you're used to. It's a sobering thought, that a false accusation, or simply being on the wrong side of a powerful person, could have devastating consequences with very little recourse. And then there were the trials by ordeal. These were truly bizarre and utterly terrifying. If there was no clear evidence, an accused person might be subjected to an ordeal, believed to be a way for God to reveal the truth. For example, the ordeal by hot iron involved the accused holding a red-hot iron bar for a certain distance. If their hand healed quickly, they were innocent. If not, they were guilty. Or the ordeal by water, where the accused was thrown into a body of water. If they floated, they were guilty because the pure water rejected them. If they sank, they were innocent, though they might drown in the process. A quirky, lesser-known tidbit is that these trials were eventually outlawed by the Church in the 13th century, largely because they realized how unfair and dangerous they were. You'd probably be completely bewildered by the concept of your fate resting on something so arbitrary and painful. For nobles, the law was often different, more about honour, duels and political manoeuvring, but still incredibly harsh if you fell out of favour with someone more powerful. Justice was not blind. It was often heavily influenced by social status, wealth and connections. It's a point of contention among historians if these harsh punishments were truly effective deterrents, or if they simply reflected the brutal realities of a society struggling to maintain order without modern institutions. You'd quickly learn to keep your head down, to be incredibly respectful to those in authority, and to avoid any situation that might draw unwanted attention from the Lord or his men. Your freedom, your bodily integrity, and even your life would feel incredibly precarious, subject to the whims of powerful individuals rather than a consistent rule of law. You'd probably spend a lot of time worrying, wondering if you might accidentally offend someone, or if a minor disagreement could escalate into a major legal problem. You'd also realize that your voice, your arguments, and your modern sense of justice would count for absolutely nothing in a medieval court. You've navigated the medieval justice system, or, more accurately, tried to stay far away from it. Now let's consider something fundamental to your modern existence. Information. You wake up, you check your phone for news, you browse the internet for answers, you stream content. In medieval Europe, this entire world of instant information simply did not exist. Welcome to a world without internet, without mass-produced books, and where news travelled at the speed of a walking person. For most people, your world would be incredibly small and local. News would travel primarily by word of mouth. Imagine hearing about events from the next village, or even the next town, weeks or months after they happened, perhaps from a travelling merchant or a returning pilgrim. There were no newspapers, no radio, no television, and certainly no social media. If something important happened, a new law, a declaration of war, a major feast, a town crier might announce it in the village square, shouting the news to gather crowds. This was the closest thing to a public broadcast system. You'd probably gather around, straining to hear, eager for any snippet of information about the outside world. Literacy was incredibly low. The vast majority of the population, especially commoners, could not read or write. Books were incredibly rare and precious objects, painstakingly copied by hand by scribes, usually in monasteries. They were works of art, often beautifully illustrated and incredibly expensive. Owning even one book was a sign of immense wealth and status. Forget popping to the library or browsing a bookstore. You'd probably never even see a book in your entire life, let alone read one. It's a mainstream historical fact that literacy rates during the Middle Ages were exceptionally low for the general population, with literacy largely confined to clergy and the nobility. This means that knowledge was often passed down orally through stories, songs and traditions. The church played a central role in information dissemination. Sermons were one of the main ways people learned about religious teachings, moral guidance, and sometimes even news related to the broader world, as interpreted by the local priest. The stained glass windows in churches and the religious art weren't just decorative, they were visual stories, teaching illiterate congregations about biblical events and saints' lives. For you, the church would be a primary source of any abstract or philosophical information, and you'd have to accept its teachings without the ability to easily research alternative viewpoints. The lack of mass communication meant that ideas spread slowly. New inventions, philosophical debates, or even major political shifts could take years, even decades, to fully disseminate across Europe. Your understanding of the world would be very limited, focused on your immediate surroundings, your village, your lord, and the seasons. The concept of global events or complex international politics would be utterly foreign to your daily concerns. You'd probably find yourself longing for the ability to simply look something up, to verify a rumour, or to learn about distant lands. A quirky, lesser-known tidbit is that wandering minstrels or jongleurs were important sources of entertainment and news, travelling from town to town, performing songs and telling stories about heroic deeds, local gossip and events from far-off places. They were a sort of living, breathing newspaper and entertainment channel, all rolled into one. You'd probably welcome their arrival with immense excitement, eager for a break from the monotony and a glimpse into a larger world. It's a point of contention among historians just how informed the common medieval person was about wider political or religious events. Some argue that despite limited literacy, oral networks and the church meant people had a surprising awareness of major happenings, while others emphasize the profound isolation of rural life. But for you, steeped in the instant gratification of the internet, the slowness and scarcity of information would be a constant, unsettling void. You'd realize how much of your identity and decision-making relies on easily accessible information. You'd definitely miss the ability to check the weather on your phone, or to find out how to fix a broken tool with a quick search. Your intellectual world would shrink dramatically, forcing you to rely on observation, memory, and the limited knowledge of those around you. You'd probably spend a lot of time simply observing, trying to piece together the world from the small fragments of information available. You've seen how challenging the practicalities of medieval life are, from moving around to basic housing. But now, let's gently turn our attention to something even deeper, something that shaped every single moment, every decision, and every thought in medieval Europe: faith. You might think you understand the power of belief, but in this time, religion wasn't just a part of life, it was life. It was omnipresent, woven into the very fabric of existence, bringing both comfort and profound fear. From the moment you woke up, the church would be there. You'd hear the church bells. They weren't just calling people to prayer, they marked the hours, signalling the beginning and end of the working day, the time for meals and the rhythm of communal life. You'd probably find yourself instinctively listening for them, relying on their sound to orient yourself in a world without clocks. Your local church, often the grandest building in the village, would be the spiritual and social heart of the community. It was where you were baptized, married, and eventually where your funeral would be held. It was where you sought solace, celebrated, and sometimes where you found judgment. The teachings of the church, primarily the Catholic Church, deeply influenced every aspect of your morality and your understanding of the world. You'd learn about sin, salvation, heaven, and a very real, very terrifying hell. The fear of eternal damnation was a powerful motivator, shaping your actions, your thoughts, and even your dreams. You'd confess your sins to the priest, truly believing that your immortal soul depended on it. It's a mainstream historical fact that the Church held immense temporal power during the Middle Ages, influencing rulers, laws, and the daily lives of every single person, from peasant to king. Its authority was largely unquestioned, and heresy, or going against church doctrine, was a grave offence with severe consequences. You'd quickly realise that your personal beliefs, if they differed from the church, would be best kept to yourself. Saints played a huge role in daily life. You'd have patron saints for various things, for specific illnesses, for your trade, for safe travel. You'd pray to them for intercession, believing they could appeal to God on your behalf. Relics, a bone of a saint, a piece of their clothing, even a fragment of the true cross, were considered incredibly powerful and holy objects. Pilgrimages to shrines holding these relics were common, often arduous journeys undertaken in the hope of a miracle cure, forgiveness of sins, or simply spiritual merit. Imagine setting off on a dangerous months-long journey, walking every step, just to pray at the tomb of a saint, believing it could truly change your destiny. It's a slightly funny thought, in a gentle way, that people would carry pieces of bone or fabric, believing they held actual power, but for them it was deeply real and meaningful. Superstition also intertwined with faith. While the church frowned upon outright pagan practices, belief in witches, demons, and evil spirits was widespread. You'd probably carry charms, say certain prayers, or perform small rituals to ward off misfortune or bad luck. If a crop failed, or a child fell ill, people might wonder if it was divine punishment, a test of faith, or the work of malevolent forces. The line between accepted religious belief and folk superstition was often blurry, and you'd find yourself navigating a world where invisible forces felt very real and very close. The church also dictated the calendar. Feast days and fast days punctuated the year. Fasting, abstaining from meat and sometimes other foods, was a common practice, particularly during Lent and on Fridays. But feast days were times of celebration, marking important saints' days or religious festivals, often involving communal meals, music, and merriment. These were rare moments of collective joy and respite from the relentless work, and you'd cherish them deeply. They were a reminder that even in a harsh world there were moments of shared celebration and connection. Education for most people was largely religious. You'd learn catechism, prayers, and basic moral teachings. Monasteries were centres of learning, preserving knowledge and producing those precious hand-copied books. For the common person, however, their understanding of the world was filtered through the lens of faith. Events were often seen as God's will, successes as blessings, and misfortunes as trials or punishments. This worldview provided a framework for understanding an often chaotic and unpredictable world. It gave meaning to suffering and offered the hope of a better life in the afterlife. Historians still ponder the exact balance between genuine piety and social conformity in medieval religious life. It's a point of contention if the common person fully grasped complex theological doctrines, or if their faith was more about ritual, community, and personal devotion. But one thing is clear: your modern, often secular perspective would be profoundly challenged. You'd constantly be aware of the spiritual dimension of everything around you. Every sunrise, every harvest, every illness, every death would be interpreted through the lens of divine purpose. You'd find yourself praying more, perhaps, and thinking about your soul in a way you never have before. The weight of spiritual consequences would be a constant presence, a whisper in your ear reminding you to live a righteous life, or at least to appear to, and you'd certainly miss the ability to simply express doubt without fear of serious repercussions. You've seen the immense spiritual framework of medieval Europe. Now let's revisit a very earthly, very practical, and often very dangerous aspect of daily life that's surprisingly tied to religion and survival: what you drink. We touched on it briefly when discussing food, but it deserves a deeper dive. In your modern world, you can turn on a tap and get clean, safe drinking water without a second thought. In medieval Europe, that clean, safe water was a pipe dream, and the consequences of not having it were dire. Imagine, if you will, being thirsty after a long day of hard labour. You look around for a source of water. Perhaps there's a river flowing nearby, or a village well. These seem like obvious choices, right? Not so fast. In a medieval town, rivers often served multiple purposes. They were sources of drinking water and places where waste was dumped, where animals might be watered, and where people might wash clothes. Wells, while sometimes better, could also be contaminated by surface runoff, animal waste, or unsanitary practices around them. There was no concept of water treatment plants, no filtration systems, no chlorine. What you saw was what you got, and what you got was often teeming with invisible dangers. This lack of understanding about contamination, coupled with the lack of sanitation we explored earlier, meant that drinking plain water was a gamble with your life. Diseases like dysentery, cholera, and typhoid fever, spread through contaminated water, were common and deadly. You'd witness people falling ill with terrible stomach cramps and fevers, their bodies wasting away, and you wouldn't connect it to the clear liquid they drank from the well. It's a mainstream historical fact that waterborne diseases were a leading cause of death in medieval cities and towns. The medieval person simply didn't make the connection between dirty water and sickness. So what did they drink? As we hinted before, ale and beer, and sometimes wine for the wealthier folks. But why? The brewing process for ale and beer involved boiling the water during fermentation. This boiling process, even if not fully understood at the time, killed most of the harmful bacteria and pathogens in the water. making the resulting beverage significantly safer to drink than unboiled water. It wasn't a scientific discovery, but a practical outcome. So, instead of a refreshing glass of water, you'd be reaching for a tankard of mild, often thin, ale from morning till night. Even children drank it, albeit a weaker version, often referred to as small beer. You might find yourself constantly feeling a slight buzz, a gentle warmth, and a mild taste of grain that would become your constant companion. This wasn't about getting drunk all the time, though that certainly happened too. It was about hydration and survival. Ale and beer also provided much-needed calories in a diet that could often be insufficient, especially for the working classes. They were liquid bread, a source of energy that kept people going through their demanding physical lives. Imagine having nothing but this cloudy, slightly alcoholic beverage to quench your thirst, day in and day out. You'd probably yearn for a cold, clear glass of pure water, the kind you take for granted in your modern life. Wine was the drink of choice for the nobility and wealthier classes, especially in regions where grapes grew well. Wine, too, involves fermentation, which makes it safer than untreated water. However, it was much more expensive and thus not accessible to the common peasant. You'd probably only taste wine on rare, special occasions, if ever, and it would be a completely different experience from the refined wines of today. The choice of drink profoundly impacted daily life. Imagine the logistics of brewing enough ale for an entire village, or ensuring a constant supply of safe beverages. It was a vital household task, especially for women. The need for safe liquid meant that clean water sources were incredibly valuable, but often not understood in terms of health, but rather convenience or taste. It's a point of contention among historians if the preference for ale was solely due to safety, or if taste, calories, and social custom also played a significant role. But for you, coming from a world of sterile bottled water and purified tap water, the necessity of drinking fermented beverages for basic survival would be a stark and unsettling reality. You'd quickly learn to appreciate the subtle differences in the various batches of ale, or perhaps just learn to tolerate it. A quirky, lesser-known tidbit is that some medieval cities had complex systems of conduits and aqueducts to bring water from distant, cleaner sources, showing an early, if limited, understanding of the need for clean water, though these systems were often overwhelmed by waste. But for the vast majority, the nearest puddle or river was the only option. So, as you drift off, perhaps think about that simple glass of water by your bedside. It's a luxury that would have been a miracle in medieval times, and you'd probably never take its purity for granted again. You'd learn to savour every sip, even if it had a slightly yeasty taste. You've quenched your thirst with medieval ale, and now, as the sun begins to set after another day of hard labour, you might be thinking, what do people do for fun around here? Forget scrolling through social media, binge watching your favourite shows, or playing video games. The concept of entertainment in medieval Europe was drastically different. Without screens, electricity, or even widespread literacy, people found enjoyment in very human, very communal, and often very simple ways. Your evenings would likely be spent around the communal hearth, or in a simple, dimly lit home. Storytelling was paramount. Imagine gathering with your family and neighbours, listening intently as someone recounts an old legend, a folk tale, or a story about heroic knights and faraway lands. These stories were not just entertainment, they were how history was passed down, how moral lessons were taught, and how imaginations were sparked. You'd probably find yourself drawn into the narrative, your mind painting vivid pictures in the flickering firelight, just as people have done for millennia. You'd learn to appreciate the power of a well-told story in a way you never have before. Music was also a vital part of medieval life. While instruments were often simple, lutes, flutes, drums, harps, the joy of communal singing and dancing was universal. Imagine joining in a lively folk dance during a village festival, or singing old ballads with friends and family. There were no recorded albums, no concerts, but the creation of music was a living, breathing part of daily existence. You'd find yourself humming along to familiar tunes, perhaps even learning a new instrument if you were lucky enough to have access to one. It's a mainstream historical fact that music was integral to both religious ceremonies and secular celebrations, ranging from solemn chants to lively dance tunes. Games were simple, often relying on ingenuity rather than elaborate equipment. Dice games were popular, as were board games like chess or tables, an early form of backgammon, though these might be more common among the wealthier classes. For common folk, outdoor games, wrestling, or rudimentary forms of football, more akin to a chaotic free-for-all than organised sport, provided physical outlets and amusement. You'd probably find yourself joining in, getting dirty and laughing, enjoying the simple physicality of play. And children, of course, would invent their own games with sticks, stones, and whatever natural materials were at hand. A slightly funny thought. You'd quickly learn that sports in this era involved a lot more mud and a lot fewer rules. Festivals and fairs were major events, breaking the monotony of daily life. These were often tied to religious holidays, agricultural cycles, or important local events. Imagine the excitement as merchants, entertainers, and pilgrims converged on your village, bringing exotic goods, news from afar, and lively performances. You'd witness jugglers, acrobats, perhaps even crude puppet shows. These were rare opportunities for socializing on a larger scale, for indulging in special foods, and for experiencing something truly out of the ordinary. They offered a vital psychological release from the hardships of everyday life. Feasting and drinking, especially ale, were central to social gatherings. Imagine a long wooden table laden with coarse bread, pottage, and perhaps a rare bit of roasted meat shared with a dozen neighbours. The conversation would flow, punctuated by laughter and the clinking of tankards. These were moments of community, of shared humanity, where the burdens of the day could be temporarily forgotten. It's a point of contention among historians if these forms of entertainment were truly sufficient to alleviate the stresses of medieval life, or if they simply provided brief, necessary distractions in an otherwise harsh existence. But for you, steeped in modern comforts, you'd realize how deeply satisfying these simple communal joys could be. Even just sitting around a fire, chatting, gossiping, sharing news or rumours would be a form of entertainment. There was no concept of individual, private entertainment. Everything was shared. Everything was communal. You'd learn to find joy in the presence of others, in the warmth of human connection, rather than in the flickering blue light of a screen. You might miss the anonymity of a crowd, but you'd gain a profound sense of belonging. A quirky, lesser-known tidbit is that riddles were a popular form of entertainment, sharpening wits and providing endless amusement during long evenings. You'd probably find yourself trying to solve them, enjoying the mental challenge. You'd truly understand what it means to be present and engaged with the people around you, because there was nothing else to distract you. And as you try to sleep tonight, perhaps the quiet comfort of your own bed, alone, might feel a little strange after the constant human presence of medieval life. You've tasted the simple joys of medieval entertainment. Now let's talk about the one person who held the most direct power over your daily life, the one who shaped your very existence in medieval Europe, your friendly neighbourhood lord. Forget democratic elections or a distant central government. In this era, your immediate boss, protector, and ultimate authority figure was the local landowner, the lord of the manor. In the feudal system, which defined much of medieval society, land was power. The king might be at the top, but his power was often mediated through a network of powerful lords who controlled vast territories. You, as a peasant, would live on the lord's land. You didn't own it. You were merely granted permission to work a strip of it in exchange for your labour and loyalty. This relationship was the bedrock of your existence. Your lord provided you with a place to live, a means to grow food, and crucially, protection. In a world without police forces or strong central armies, the lord's castle or fortified manor house was your refuge in times of attack from raiders or rival lords. He maintained order, settled disputes, and ensured the security of his domain. It's a mainstream historical fact that the feudal system, with its reciprocal duties between lords and vassals, was the dominant social and economic structure across much of medieval Europe. In return for this protection and the right to work the land, you owed your lord a great deal. This was primarily in the form of labour service, known as corvée. You would be obligated to spend a certain number of days each week working directly on the lord's domain, his personal land, without pay. This might involve ploughing his fields, sowing his crops, repairing his buildings, or digging ditches. This was often the hardest and most relentless work, as it was directly for the lord's benefit. You'd quickly realise that a significant portion of your hard labour wasn't even for your own family, but for the man who owned your land. This could be a source of quiet resentment, though expressing it would be unwise. Beyond labour, you also owed the lord various forms of payment, often in kind. You might have to give him a portion of your own harvest, a percentage of your grain, or perhaps chickens or eggs. You'd pay fees for using the lord's mill to grind your grain, he often owned the only mill around, or for using his oven to bake your bread. There were also various tolls and taxes. Imagine working hard to grow your crops, only to know that a substantial portion of it was destined for the lord's storerooms, not your own family's mouths. It's a point of contention among historians whether the burdens placed on peasants were purely exploitative, or if they represented a necessary and accepted trade-off for security and order in a turbulent era. The lord also held judicial authority, as we discussed. He ran the manor court, settling disputes between peasants, imposing fines, and punishing crimes. His word was law, and there was little you could do to challenge it. You'd learn to be extremely deferential, to never speak out of turn, and to always show respect. Your life literally depended on staying in his good graces, or at least not drawing his wrath. A quirky, lesser-known tidbit is that some lords would hold grand feasts and entertainments, inviting their peasants to participate, which served to reinforce social bonds and show off the lord's generosity and power, albeit in a carefully controlled environment. These occasions would offer a rare glimpse into a more luxurious life, a brief break from your own hard existence. Your lord would be a constant looming presence in your life. You'd see his castle or manor house from your fields. You'd hear tales of his exploits, his decisions and his temperament. His decisions about land use, justice and military service would directly impact your family and your community. While some lords might be benevolent and just, others could be tyrannical and cruel, and you would have no choice but to obey. There was no concept of moving away to escape a bad lord. Your freedom of movement was heavily restricted. You were tied to the land and to your lord. Your sense of personal agency would be very different from your modern self. You wouldn't have a say in where you lived, what taxes you paid, or how much land you could work. Your life would be largely predetermined by your birth into the peasant class and your relationship with the lord. You'd probably spend a lot of time calculating how to meet your obligations to the lord while still keeping enough for your family to survive. And you definitely miss the idea of being able to choose your own path, to leave a job you didn't like, or to simply express your opinion without fear of retribution. The shadow of the Lord would hang over every decision, every conversation, every waking moment. You've seen the big, overarching challenges of medieval life, from the powerful lord to the dangerous water. But now let's bring it right down to the tiny, everyday details, the constant nagging challenges that, by themselves, would wear you down surprisingly quickly. These are the small things that were in fact huge obstacles to comfort and survival, the constant little annoyances that would make you yearn for your modern life. Let's start with the dark. When the sun went down in medieval Europe, it became dark. Not just dimly lit like your house at night, but truly, overwhelmingly dark. There was no widespread electricity, no streetlights beyond a few flickering lanterns near a city gate. Inside your home, light came from a crackling fire, a few crude candles made from tallow, animal faya which often smelled rather unpleasant and flickered constantly, or perhaps an oil lamp. These gave off minimal light, barely enough to see your hand in front of your face. Imagine trying to do anything intricate, like sewing or reading, if you could read. After dark, it would be almost impossible. You'd probably spend a lot of time sitting in semi-darkness, listening to the sounds of the night, your other senses heightened. It's a mainstream historical fact that the medieval night was a time of true darkness, forcing activity to cease or rely on incredibly limited artificial light sources. This profound darkness contributed to a different perception of time and danger. Then there are the pests. Oh, the pests. We've touched on fleas and lice, but they were just the beginning. Rats and mice would be constant companions, scuttling in the walls, nibbling at stored food and spreading disease. Flies would buzz constantly, especially in summer, drawn by the pervasive smells and lack of sanitation. Bed bugs would be a regular nuisance, making your straw bed even less appealing. Imagine trying to sleep soundly when you're constantly aware of tiny itchy creatures crawling on you, or the rustle of rodents in the corners. It's a slightly funny yet grim thought that your skin would probably be constantly itchy, and you'd develop a perpetual unconscious habit of scratching. You definitely miss your pest control services. The weather, too, would be a constant, unforgiving challenge. There was no central heating or air conditioning, no insulated homes. In winter, your small, smoky dwelling would be bone-chillingly cold, forcing you to huddle close to the fire, always a risk for accidental burns. Water would freeze, making daily chores even harder. In summer, the heat could be oppressive, especially during hard labour in the fields, with no escape from the relentless sun. You'd be perpetually either too hot or too cold, your body constantly adjusting to extremes. A quirky, lesser-known tidbit is that medieval people often wore layers even indoors to combat the cold, and many slept bundled in clothes or under thick woolens. You'd learn to layer up, to appreciate the smallest scrap of warmth, and to yearn for a gentle breeze on a sweltering day. The sheer physical effort required for everything would be another constant drain. Want water? Go fetch it from the well. Want to cook? Chop wood, light a fire, grind grain. Want clean clothes? Wash them by hand in cold water. There were no shortcuts, no labour-saving devices beyond the most basic tools. Every single task, from making a meal to keeping warm, was a physical endeavour. Your body would be perpetually tired, your muscles aching, and your hands calloused. You'd truly understand the meaning of manual labour in a way you never have before, and the simplest modern convenience would seem like a miracle. And finally, the sensory overload. We started with the smells and sounds, but imagine that constant assault, day in and day out, with no real escape. The pervasive smells of animals, smoke, and waste. The constant noise of human and animal life without the buffer of modern insulation or quiet spaces. The lack of personal privacy, always surrounded by others. Your senses would be constantly bombarded, and your modern mind, used to moments of quiet and calm, would find it incredibly difficult to truly relax. It's a point of contention among historians if medieval people simply developed a higher tolerance for such conditions, or if the constant sensory input led to higher stress levels or different forms of mental fatigue. But for you, the sheer density of it all would be exhausting. You'd learn to filter, perhaps, or to simply endure, but the idea of a peaceful, private moment would be a distant dream. You'd find yourself constantly battling these small, persistent inconveniences. Your clothes would always be slightly scratchy, your feet always a little sore, your skin always a bit itchy. Your hunger would be a familiar ache, and your thirst would be ever present. You'd be perpetually aware of your body, its aches, its needs, and its vulnerability. The sheer grit and resilience of medieval people, simply to exist, would become abundantly clear. And you'd quickly realise that lasting a day, let alone a lifetime, in medieval Europe would be a monumental achievement for your modern self. You'd probably spend a lot of time dreaming of a hot shower, a soft bed, and a very, very quiet room. Now, as you gently drift, let's bring you back, slowly. Feel the softness of your own bed beneath you, the familiar texture of your blankets. Notice the gentle hum of your modern world around you, the quiet, reassuring sounds that fill your space. Breathe in the clean air of your room, free from the smoke and smells of centuries past. Feel the warmth or the coolness of your home, regulated just for your comfort. Imagine the simple luxury of turning on a light with the flick of a switch, of stepping into a warm, cleansing shower, of reaching for a glass of pure, cool water. Think of the incredible ease of communication, the vast ocean of information at your fingertips, the countless ways you can entertain yourself, all privately and at your leisure. These aren't just conveniences, they are profound differences that separate your life from the daily grind of medieval existence. The journey we took tonight was a gentle exploration of a very different time, a time that truly tested the human spirit in ways we can barely comprehend. But you don't have to live there. You are here now, in your own comfortable space, safe and sound. Let the sounds of the medieval village fade, the smells dissipate, and the constant challenges soften into distant echoes. All that's left is the quiet comfort of your present moment. Your body is warm, your mind is calm, and the world is still. Feel yourself sinking deeper into your mattress, feeling heavier, more relaxed with each breath. The worries of the day and the imagined discomforts of the past are dissolving, floating away. You are safe. You are warm. You are ready for a truly peaceful night.